All right, we are live, and on today's episode, I interview a father, best-selling author, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, coach, creator of Because Jiu-Jitsu, the leader in Jiu-Jitsu entertainment. He's the host of the Social Disorder podcast, which is the top 1% in podcast ratings. You can also join his Jiu-Jitsu forum on School, the fastest growing worldwide online BJJ community. Welcome to the Winner's Circle, Drew Weatherhead.
Hey, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, excited to connect, get to know you more. As I was mentioning to you before I hit record on this, these conversations aim to uplift, inspire, and empower the listeners tuning in to just move forward with greater faith and belief on their hero's journey. And let's get into it. The first question, a really positive one. Drew, what do you love about your personal world right now? There's a lot of stuff going on the external. What do you love about your very personal world?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great place to start actually, because it's something that has been ever changing basically around 2017, 2018, I made a decision to quit doing the 9 to 5 thing. I mean, it was actually more than 9 to 5. I was working 10 to 12 hours a day as a journeyman welder, about as high up in the shop welding circuit as I could get in Red Deer, Alberta. I was making decent coin in a union job, and I was miserable. After about 5 years of doing that in a career I'd been in for 15 years, I was like legitimately depressed and concerned in my mid 30s that this was going to be the rest of my life until I got to retire at 65. And I was just not interested in that. And I came across, or I guess the opportunity kind of came across me, where my company ended up being bought out, and I had a decision or a choice that sort of a bifurcation of possibilities. I could either follow the work up north through the oil field in Alberta, which I never wanted to do. Ever since I started into the trades, I never wanted to go north because I knew that that basically takes me away from my family. It's going to be a lot more money, but almost I'm basically an absent father at that point, and that was never a sacrifice I was willing to take or make. Or the other option was to take a severance at about $10,000 per year served there, which at that point was 5 years. So I could take a $50,000 severance and go my merry way. And I sat down with my wife and decided that A, we're not going to take the severance, but B, I'm not going to stay in welding anymore. And we have an opportunity with this unexpected nest egg to actually do something on our own. And I'd never owned a small business before or anything of the like, but I knew I was a brown belt at that point in jiu-jitsu, that that was my primary passion, that I would rather do something in regards to jiu-jitsu professionally than I would ever want to continue on in my trade, even though I had the ticket and I had all the qualifications. I wanted to make that lateral move at that point, or you could make an argument that it was not lateral, it was actually quite down the ladder because I had to start from the bottom and build myself up. I didn't have a gym at that point. I was just a student, so I had to build a student base, and the whole thing. And this was what that $50,000 was basically going to be put towards. Is it's making a bet. It's asking my wife, "Are you willing to bet on me that I can make this thing work before the 50,000 runs out?" And it may sound like a lot of money to people who have a solid job, but if you don't and you've got a mortgage and kids and everything else, including all the overhead of starting a business, and 50,000 is like maybe 4 to 6 months you have to make it work, because if you don't start bringing the money back in, you're going to start hitting the negative, and those credit cards and lines of credit fill up real fast. So I made that bet on myself in 2018 and went hard. I went about as hard as I possibly could. And within about a year to, yeah, about a year, I managed to get myself into my own building, got a lease, I think it was actually a 5 year lease into this place that was sort of Main Street for the tiny town that I was in Black Falls, Alberta, and settled down into that. And then, I mean, you could say that that was the cherry on top and that was the hero's journey, but what it actually was kind of the starting line of what happened. If you remember, you have to think back 1,000 years ago in the year 2020, something happened that didn't bode very well for gyms, and I didn't know that that was coming by about 2018. So I had about a year and a half before we were had to hit the brakes in a way that nobody was prepared for, nobody that I knew was prepared for. And I had just started to get into the black at that point, where we were thinking like maybe we're going to start outgrowing this little gym and I'll have to look at some other places. And then, January, February of 2020 hit, and it was 3 weeks to flatten the curve, and then it was 6 weeks, then 3 months, then 6 months, and it just went on perpetually up and down, closed, shut, the whole thing back and forth, pods, distance learning, Zoom classes, all this nonsense that basically meant you can't do jujitsu anymore indefinitely for no, there was no window of when this is going to be over, and every time that there was, it would end or it would extend or something to that effect, and we just found ourselves in this perpetual spiral of having to make this choice again. It's like, do we stick with this thing because we can make it work when it works, but we're just not allowed to make it work right now. And I got to tell you, like, it was a seriously dark time for us over an extended time where by about May of 2021, we had extended and played every possible financial trick and pulled every financial bunny out of the magic hat that we could possibly at that point, and we were just drowning in debt and had to make a totally different um, lateral or downwards move to not only shut the business down, but to sell our house and to move into a travel trailer where we've been living full time on the road since 2021. We've been almost 4 years, is our fourth year now. Where I'm podcasting right now down from Waco, Texas, even though I'm an Albertan, because half the year we spend basically below the frost line so that we can live in the travel trailer. And that's been the continual journey and sort of to roundabout come back to your question at the beginning, like where I find myself growing and experiencing the change that is my daily life at this point.
Wow, what an incredible story. I don't even know where to begin. But a question I ask all my guests right at the beginning, I think it would be apropos right now, and that pertain to your personal mission. So in all the roles that you currently play, um, not only as a father, author, coach, entrepreneur, just everything, citizen of Canada, of the US, of the world, what is your mission that guides you in everything that you do, Drew?
That's kind of an interesting question because it's something that I've had to answer for myself several different times along the way, and it shifts and adjusts and it like by a degree at a time, but given enough time, a degree becomes quite a difference of trajectory. And I would say if I were to just answer that in the most meta way possible, because I could get into specifics, but they change as time goes on as well, is I am I am trying at this point to really dig down into that old Socratic question that was presented by him, if you know your philosophy and history, by the oracle at Delphi, who entreated him to know thyself. And so I've been on a
Hmm.
journey to know who I am as a person, because to know thyself not only gives you the latitude to understand the possibility before you, but also allows for you to stretch outwards into other avenues that you haven't yet. Because I found, and I know that it's not just me, so hopefully this resonates to your listeners too, is we define ourselves by all sorts of different things. I had defined myself as a welder at one point. I defined myself as a gym owner at another point, as a black belt at another point, an author as another point. And all of these things sort of aggregated as value adds, but didn't actually speak to the core of who I was as a person. And it's that core that I've been digging down and finding all of these possibilities as I go. There's a philosopher that I talk about on my podcast from time to time. I've written about in a couple of my books. He was about in the 1950s, mid 1900s, French philosopher by the name of Gilles Deleuze. And he had a lot of interesting ideas, but one of the ones, although it isn't particular to him, it really resounded to me in the way that he described it. He talked about, in regards to the self, um, for example, if you happened to be the world's foremost pianist, you were the best piano player in the world, and everybody knew you, you were world renowned for this, everybody knew you by your fame and your accolade everywhere you went. Were you that famous piano player before you ever touched your first finger to the first key? That is to say, was that something that you were, or is that something that you became? Because if it's the latter, if it's something that you became, which clearly it is because of years of effort and work to build into that one particular avenue, has that become what you actually are, or is that an addendum to who you originally were? And that's the question that I've been trying to answer for myself, because I could make the argument that I am a black belt, that I am the creator for Because Jitsu, or I am, all of these things that I could pile on top of it. But what those really are in the Deleuzian sense is affects or after effects of who I actually am. So to come back to the point, that's been the mission that I've been exploring through, and it's led me in all sorts of different directions. I mean, with the guiding principle of I'm obviously a father and a caretaker to my family. I need to make money. I need to be responsible in that sense. But I would have never guessed that I would have been the host of a years running podcast. I would have never guessed that I would have gone into authorship. I had never been like, I didn't even think that you could write a book. I thought authors write books. You have to be an author to write a book. And I was just some guy. Turns out that you can, and I have. And it's again kind of shifted the trajectory and opened up the purview of possibility in front of me to the point that it's hard to put a single title on myself or to sort of wear a particular hat because all they are again affects of what I'm trying to discover of myself.
Hmm. Wow, that's so interesting. What lit that spark in you, Drew? To ask that question to begin that look inward. What lit
Hmm.
that spark?
Um, COVID, I think just unabashedly, the whole pandemic, everything that was involved sociologically, everything that was involved interpersonally, all of like for that time period that my gym was shut down, which was somewhere, I can't remember, some like 15, 17 months of perpetual indefinite up and down. I was still going to quote work, basically sitting in my office in an empty gym for like 5 days out of the week because I'm trying to figure out a way to make some sort of income through at that point, I started going into online courses and classes and trying to, they say pivot. You just need to pivot, right? Well, what pivoting looks like in reality is basically falling out of an airplane without a backpack, without a parachute on, and trying to figure out how to find the softest landing before you splat. And that's kind of how that felt day in and day out. And I don't know, it became this introspection by default. Like I was put in a place where I had to ask hard questions of myself. And the longer I was in those places, and especially once we hit the road and had to like really figure things out on the run, it's really what it felt like. There were so many questions that came back down to foundational introspective questions like that, where it wasn't like, what are we going to do tomorrow? It's like, what is my actual reason for being right now, which sounds auspicious, but really like if that is the specter hanging over your head, it's something you can't help but think about. And so in that way, I started podcasting for myself and for my own sanity, to be honest, because there were a lot of things that were going on in the world at that point in 2021. I was literally, and it sounds hyperbolic to some people who never experienced it, but essentially I had fled my country because of vaccine mandates that were basically going to prevent me from being able to move. We ended up leaving the country 3 weeks before we wouldn't have been legally allowed to fly. And at that point, we couldn't cross the border because we weren't essential travel. So, as somebody who was living in a travel trailer at that point, you can't live through the Canadian winter in a travel trailer. So, like, we were literally had to flee against our will from our own country. And it's it's a position I never expected myself to be in, and it was kind of like we were being thrown by the winds of fate at that point, and you're kind of just a passenger along that journey. And if you don't start thinking about the deep questions at that point, I don't even know if you're paying attention because I couldn't avoid them. And so the longer I podcasted, the more I talked about big, important questions of the day and of humanity and of society with myself and then with a bunch of other guests that were going through the same thing. Like these questions became the mode du jour that really started to inform who I was, as well as not just inform who I was, but sort of lead me towards that path of discovery of who I was.
Hmm. So you were thrown by the winds of fate, and you we continue to see R, but it was especially intense at that time. Where did you find faith? In yoga, there's a philosophy. It's called Ishvara Pranidhana, and it's just complete surrender in the now to a force beyond, greater than yourself, that is guiding you on your journey. And other people turn to religion, but yeah, where did you find faith? To get through all this, just to trust in the process and just to go for it.
Um, I would love to say that I found faith early in that process, but I was very devoid of it for the majority of the first few years. Like I was born into a Christian family and had a very like probably enviable, great Christian family upbringing. And by about, like I said, when I was welding in that final job before I ended up getting my severance, I was legitimately depressed and I had lost all my faith in God at that point. In the early years of my 30s, I got into the new atheists through Sam Harris and some of his writing, and I listened to his podcast a lot. And he basically disabused me of everything to do with faith and all of the stupidity of the theological endeavor. And I, started to feel more humanist in that way. And it felt like the right thing to do because I was an intellectual, and intellectual people don't believe in such things as fairies and goblins and sky daddies and all of these pejoratives that they like to sort of haughtily laugh at the people who do from. And then after, all of these things hit, I was well into, this is interesting. I never would have defined myself as an atheist, but I had stopped defining myself as a theist. So I really had no mooring at that point. In the theological sense, I was adrift. And I didn't care that I was adrift because I felt like it was nonsensical. But then, given enough time through the maelstrom of what happened through 21, through 22, through 23, I ended up finding my way back to a broader version of faith than I ever had before, of what was basically bequeathed to me through my family upbringing of the default mode of Christianity. Um, and to be honest, I wish I had come to that sooner. I was very stubborn about that because I thought I had already gotten over this, but really discovered some of the truths and some of the deep value of what our ancestors and predecessors have known for millennia before us.
So how did you get away from it, and then how did you find it again?
Well, I wrote a couple of books after I started podcasting. After the first year, I wrote a book called Consciousness, Reality, and Purpose, which sounds like an incredibly arduous task to write something about, especially as a never written before author. But I took it on because these were the thoughts that were not only pregnant in my brain, but wouldn't leave me alone. So I did all sorts of deep research into all those three things, and that book is broken into those three portions. There's a portion on reality, consciousness, and purpose. And I had to not only research for myself, but answer these questions for myself in a way that left open-ended discovery routes for other people to ask and find for themselves along that path. And through that process, I actually kind of ended up leading myself towards, I broke it down like this, like everything in the philosophical sense, they break things down by different constructs like axiology, ontology. And for me, I knew I had an axiology, which is like, what is the actual starting point of my beliefs? Do I believe in something as basic as reality? Which sounds like a silly thing to ask, but in the philosophical sense, you can go two directions from that point. You can go full Bostromian philosophy, thinking that we're in a simulation and nothing is real, or you can go full, Aristotle or Aristotelian philosophy and believe that everything is grounded in pure reality and carry on from there. And I had to answer for myself that I was of the belief in actual objective reality. And from that point on, I had to start building out what I believed was the ontology of the reality that I lived in. And for myself, I built a construct in my first book and then expanded it into my second book called Layers of Truth that is based on three pillars. One of the pillars for me of what I consider to have a well-balanced worldview, not the pure truth of reality, but being that we live in a version of reality that is subjective. We can't know total reality. We have to build for ourselves a perception through the constructs that we believe are real. And for me to have a well-balanced worldview, I decided that I needed to have grounding in the scientific, that's one pillar, in the philosophic, that's the second pillar, and the third one is the theologic. And through that belief of the axioms of that construct, I found myself wanting in the theologic in a way that I couldn't look myself in the eye knowing that I wrote about the value of those three pillars and be lacking in one so badly. I had allowed that to wallow to the degree that um, it was a vestige of what it used to be, where growing up through my teenagers and 20s, I would have probably said that the pillar of the theological was my strongest pillar, and that I had to build out the philosophical and the scientific. And then I found myself in my 30s highly overbuilt through the scientific and the philosophical and totally atrophied in the theological. And because of that missing pillar, I found my worldview was off balance, and I had to reappropriate and recalibrate because of that lack. And so that's how I found my way back to what I purposefully allowed to fallow off to the side while I built out the philosophic and scientific. And I don't know if that's ever a process that finds perfect unity, but it is a process through the disbalance that you can reassess yourself and figure out what you need to balance your worldview out from if you're finding, again, you've got some reasons why you're weaker in one of those three things.
Hmm. Let's examine this in how you teach this to your kids. You have four kids, ages 6 to 13, and they've been homeschooled. You and your wife have been homeschooling them. So yeah, how do you teach them these pillars from an early age to kind of break this down to the foundations?
Hmm. Well, thankfully, most of what I have to build into them at a scientific level is very easy because it's just the world that's around them. And you were talking about this before as an educator, how there's value to kids learning through action and through the efforts of getting their hands dirty into different processes that are brand new to them. And that's, I mean, that's really how people learn. I know um, the famous psychologist these days, Jordan Peterson, he talks about play as the most valuable asset to child level learning. And so they play a lot with each other, with friends they meet on the road. And we make sure that they're outside all the time because, I mean, they basically live in a hallway with wheels. And there's really nowhere to do anything on the inside. So they're kicked outside, honestly. They're outside more than they're inside, especially compared to when they used to live in a house. In a house, I would have to force them, drag them by the ear to go outside and play. Now there's just basically nothing to do in the trailer, so they're outside all the time and they're learning about stuff all the time at like a visceral level, I would call that sort of the scientific and sort of building out the philosophic. But the philosophic is probably something that will take them well into their 20s because, I mean, just physiologically, their brain won't finish maturing until they're about 24 or 25, the frontal cortex, that is. And at that point, you can maybe start to put some real effort into understanding why you believe what you believe, the truth of what you believe, and try to, validate or invalidate that as you go. But we're putting a real primacy on building out the theological for them because I think that that was a gift that my parents gave me that I definitely didn't value in the time that I threw it off to the side. And that would have been a lot more of a value add in the time that I needed it when I found myself wanting. And I don't want them to be lacking that. So we take them to church. We teach them Christianity is the religion that we're bringing them up with because it was what I was brought up with, and I find the value in that for myself. And I will again build them up in the way that they should go, and as they deal with that as they grow older is basically their task once they fledge out of the nest.
Hmm. Okay, let's talk about this well-balanced world view and how we keep that balance. There's big influence from the media on
Hmm.
our children, and not only on our children, all of us, whether that be through social media, whatever we use as our news source, like the television programming that we watch that instills kind of like this is what a man should be, this is what a woman, this is like what successful looks like, commercials, advertisements. How do we balance ourselves in a world where we're constantly being bombarded by outside messaging that, for the most part, I'd say, is fueled by consumerism and capitalism to make profit off of you, telling you that you are not enough. You need this to be successful. You need this to be peaceful.
Hmm.
Yeah, how do you find your balance yourself and share this with your kids and your listeners? How do we stay balanced in this world?
Yeah, that's something that I feel like we're maybe in generation or in a time in history right now where it's never been more obvious the affects of the zeitgeist on us because we're inundated, like you said, through mainstream media, through social media, through the way that that plays out in reality around us, albeit through politics or through just social interaction. It's something that you can't get away from as much as I would love to. I would love to get away from it. And I tried to, remain blissfully ignorant as long as I could until I couldn't anymore. But because of that, and because you know, I've gained the hard lessons that I've had to over the last few years, I've made a very purposeful point of pointing that out to my children who are only just starting to get into social media, and only the elder two right now. My eldest two are 11 and 13, and we're just barely allowing for them to have access to phones and internet for that reason, because, I feel like it's mostly some negative thing, to be honest, especially at that age group. The peer pressure is something that is highly estimated, I think, by a lot of parents, and how quickly and how pervasively it can poison young kids' perceptions of themselves and the way that they value themselves. So we've been very, I guess you could call it sheltering of our kids in that way, but in the way that we are allowing them to have like restricted Instagram accounts that are curated and we can see what they're seeing and stuff like that. When stuff comes up that's like maybe something I don't agree with or I feel like is dangerous, I'll ask them, like, what do you think about this? And then we'll have conversations about that. And I try to make it a purposeful thing for me as the parent to talk to them and have a dialogue, a Socratic dialogue, instead of sort of barking orders of you can't this and you shouldn't that. I want them to come to the conclusion for themselves and sort of rationalize it in that manner, because I think that that will eventually, again, build the muscle of the philosophic in them in a way that they can ask questions and not feel wrong for asking questions, because that's something that I think a lot of people, especially in the society that we live in that is homogenated in a way, philosophically, I think, where we believe like you're supposed to believe the thing because the world says we're supposed to believe the thing, and that's as far as you go on it. This is never a question of if, it's just that. And the question of if becomes a dangerous thing in those societies. And not only should we constantly be asking if and why, but we should be wrestling with the answers to that. And it should be something that is not, sort of held apart on a pedestal, but it should be dissected and, openly. So for me to find balance is again that perpetual, it's like finding balance on a skateboard. You don't find balance and then you've got balance. You have to perpetually find balance because the world is changing around you. There's ups, there's downs, there's backs and forths and sideways. And, you want to do certain tricks, you're going to have to maintain balance under pressure against things that are trying to take it away from you. And it's kind of something like that. Or I guess you could make the analogy of waves if you want to talk about surfing. It's like balance is not a stagnant thing. You know that through jujitsu. You can't just stand in somebody's spider guard and expect you to have balance the whole time when their whole objective is to take it away from you. It's a constant back and forth and finding effort. And it's not that it's something that can be found. It's a process that needs to become normalized.
I love that analogy. You mentioned being blissfully ignorant until you couldn't anymore. Let's delve more into that. And like you do so much service. Like when, yeah, let's just talk about service and what you learned about how to be a best of service to others and what pushed you into needing to do that.
Mm. Well, for me, I think this has something to do with certain people's personalities. Like there's the big five personality traits out there that will sort of predispose people to certain avenues and proclivities based upon what they value. Um, in in the third portion of my first book, I talked about in the purpose portion, I talked about something that came to me honestly one day while I was sitting down and sort of looking down at the gravel, and I saw an ant sort of wandering around. And for a second, I sort of forgot about what was going on and what I was thinking about, and just watched this tiny itty bitty little creature navigating these massive boulders. And I'm thinking, like, what could possibly be going through this thing's head right now? Like, it's not inert matter. There is a thought process that's involved here. And you can talk about instinct and the, level of intelligence, and you can get really, nitty gritty and nuanceical about that. But I was looking at sort of the meta of what is it like in the mind of the ant right now? It can't be doing like high level quadratic rationalization about what's going on. What it's doing, and I came to the conclusion that it must be doing what it most wants to do. There's nothing else that could be, there's no ant overlord behind it whipping it to go do the things it needs to do for the colony, but in a way that it is going out every single morning out of its safety of its colony to go discover and maybe never come back again. For the sake of the colony, it isn't actually for the sake of the colony, it's for the sake of itself, and it's trying to find what it most wants to do. And that's always something that's resonated with me is I'm willing to take risks to go do things that I most want to do. And as it turns out, I kind of open up a pathway for other people to follow me. And that wasn't for the purpose of opening up that pathway. To continue the analogy of the ants, when ants leave their colony, they leave a trail of pheromones so that A, they can find their way back, but also so that other ants know which way they went if they find something valuable. And I feel like there's sort of an analogous process that happens in society is people who venture out for themselves originally, sort of to satiate that inner desire for themselves, open up the possibility and the latitude for others to do the same in a way that makes it easier as they carry on. For example, I started when I was just a purple belt. I think I had just gotten my purple belt in jiu-jitsu. I started doing tournaments, hosting and promoting tournaments in Alberta. And for me, it was because there weren't enough tournaments in Alberta. And I felt as a competitor like I wanted more tournaments. And I wasn't going to wait around for other people to do it. And I wasn't going to ask other people to do it for me. I just said, I'll just start my own tournament. So I started my own tournament from the desire or the need or the want of more tournaments in the area. Now, I mean, ironically, I've never competed in my own tournament because I have to run the damn things. But what it did was open up almost philanthropically open up this possibility for other people to gain experience and qualify and test their own jujitsu because of the desire that I had that I would just relegate back to the mind of the ant. This was not something that I had a 10-year business plan laid out for. It was just something I really needed to do. And it's continued. I've been doing it for over a decade now. And I've actually started the process to plan the next one that's happening in February just today. So it's an ongoing thing that has built out. And I mean, I don't know how many lives I've touched in that last decade plus through tournaments, but it's not zero, and it's probably somewhere in the four digits at this point. And although that wasn't the purpose, that is the flowering effect of sort of trusting that process and the way that it radiates through society.
I love that. And I also really love and appreciate and admire your ability to take risks. And you've shown this all along your journey. Where did this come from? How come it's become so easy for you to take risk, or is it something that has been gradually growing?
Yeah, it's definitely something that takes practice. It's a muscle you have to flex to build up for sure. Um, and I mean, I could make a joke about you become more risk averse the more brain damage you take. I've definitely been knocked out a few times in martial arts, so maybe that's it. But all jokes aside, I know actually the exact moment in my life when I learned that lesson, or at least in a way that I remember to this day and have ever since. And I was about 12 years old at a swimming pool with my friends, and there's a variety of different heights of diving boards. And you would start on the 1 meter. It's just, three and a bit feet off the water. It's springy. You can do a couple dives, couple tricks. Then you can go up to the 3 meter, which is also springy, but it's, three times the height. And you can really get some air before you go into the water. And then there was the 5 meter platform, which was a cement obelisk essentially that you could just walk off of. It felt like to a 12-year-old who was a shrimpy kid to begin with. I didn't hit my growth spurt till I was like 18 years old. So I was always the shrimp in the friend group, and walking up there, it was looking, I might as well have been looking off the top of the CN Tower. Like it was a forever infinity down to the water. And my friend, who was much more outgoing than me and kind of the show off in the group, he was diving off the platform and kept egging me on. The peer pressure was building. And I'm like, I'm going to die if I go off that. There's no way I'm going off that. And finally, he somehow convinced me to walk up the steps. I waited in line behind like 10 other kids and walked up the steps to the top of that thing. And I walked to the edge and kind of hung my toes off and looked down through like the bald eagle screeching through the infinity down to the water. And I looked back and there was obviously a line of kids waiting for me. So I'm like, all right, there are some options on the table, and one that I'm taking off right away is there is no way I'm walking back down those steps. I'm stuck. There's no way I'm walking. The only way out of this is off this thing. So I told myself, all I'm going to do is I'm going to keep walking. I walked back to the start of the platform. I was like, I'm just going to keep walking forward until I walk literally off the edge. I told myself that, and I resolved it in my mind. I'm just going to keep walking till I walk off, and I did. It was the most inelegant dive of all time. I basically just fell off the edge. I hit the water. Obviously, I survived. It was a ton of fun, and I went back up and did it about 100 more times that day. And ever since that, I remember one of the things I told myself as I was walking towards the edge is I'm going to walk until I'm off and I can make all my regrets on the way down. So I decided, and I remember this whenever I have like these risky sort of dichomatic problems that I can go one way or the other. And there's a risk involved in obviously in one route over the other, but maybe there's more reward in that sort of frontier that you haven't explored yet, which is typically the case. I always tell myself I'm going to try it first and then make my regrets after that. I'm not going to make the regrets first and then not try it. I'm always going to try the thing first and see how it goes. And so that has been my axiom, I guess you could say, since I was 12, is I'm always going to try it first and make my regrets on the way down. I need to dive in before I really know.
Hmm. Amazing. Let's leave some pheromones, as per your analogy, for other heroes on the path who find themselves at the crossroads of should and must. So, like the path should is the things they've heard from like their parents, from school, from the generations before them. Like you should do this, you should play it safe. Like the safe, secure, the known world, and the must is like the deep knowing in your heart that tells you to buy that trailer, to
Mhm,
start that jujitsu school, to write that book. But so many people are so worried about like the shoulds and the fear that those shoulds have instilled in them that they're stuck at that crossroads of should and must. What advice would you have for someone right
mhm.
there, stuck in the mud?
Yeah, well, I can speak to generalities because everybody's situation is going to be different. And again, it's going to rely to a certain degree on those character traits that they have. Some people are just more outgoing and adventuresome in general, and other people are much more insular in general. And I'm not saying that this doesn't mean or precludes one over the other, but it is going to sort of qualify how likely they are to take the forthcoming advice, which to me is so a lot of the psychology and philosophy that I started learning in the modern era here goes back through Jordan Peterson, who's just so popular these days that he's one of those sort of door openers and frontier blazers for people that have never stepped into those spaces. And for me, I kind of started learning through him, and it led me to his predecessor in Carl Jung, who was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud back in the early 1900s. And he had a similar but also divergent philosophy or psychology of psychoanalysis. And he would talk about something that's so Peterson's first book is called Maps of Meaning, and it's based upon a construct that can broadly be described as chaos and order. And you'll hear him talk about this in a lot of different ways in a lot of different scenarios. But basically, what he's talking about is the known and the unknown. So, to speaking to your example of the way that is known, the way that your parents have laid out, these are the guardrails to keep you safely on the path and keep you away from the danger that, although you've never experienced, we've experienced or our parents have experienced, and just trust me, I know better, and we're going to follow the safe path that has the guardrails, and I can tell you where you're going to be in 10 years from now because we've run this path. We've had those pheromones laid out very thickly between now and then. And the opposite of that, or at least the difference in poles is chaos or the unknown. And the unknown is something that is it's something that is both dangerous and exciting in equal measure. Now, the excitement that it takes to push somebody into the unknown can also lead to their destruction. It can lead you off a cliff that the guardrails were preventing you from falling down, but it can also lead you up a mountain path that nobody's discovered yet to a faster or more valuable route than the known road would have. And this is the inviting the opportunity and the danger in the whole thing is you get to make your own mind up and find out for yourself. And the problem and the value to it is nobody's going to know except you until you try it, because nobody's lived your life and nobody's going to make the choices that you make perfectly the same that you are going to, and the outcomes are going to be different. Now, the good news is that this is a process that you can go back and forth from, because people, they tend to live in a sort of bipolar reality of it's either one or zero, it's plus or minus, it's pro or con. And if you're doing con, well, now you're going to die. It's like, no, you can go back and forth between those two, and that's a part of the balancing that we were talking about before. Is if you run into problems because of the choices that you've made, whether it is the safe choice through the known or the unsafe choice through the unknown, you can always backtrack, or at least learn in route and adjust for the experience that you have. And that's something that I don't think enough people talk about, is you don't just have to make dangerous decisions all the time. You can make dangerous decisions and learn from them in a way that would be like a cautionary tale for yourself and for people around you, that leads to those guardrails that maybe you put up for yourself. Or you can just continue to venture out into that unknown. I mean, there's a poem that I wrote into both my books that's from H.P. Lovecraft, and I won't try to hit it verbatim, but it was one that it definitely resonated with me. And he talks about one of the most valuable things is man's inability to correlate the contents of his own mind, and that we live on placid isles of ignorance surrounded by seas of infinity. And it wasn't meant that we should voyage far. And the sciences, each in their own right, have hitherto harmed us little, but eventually the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas and the frightful reality that we are within them, to the degree that we will either hide from the light, or we will lead ourselves to our own oblivion. And it's very Lovecraftian in the way that he finishes off that idea. But I feel like there's a balance point. There's a Tao in between there. So of the Eastern beliefs of Taoism, everybody knows what the yin yang is, what it looks like. But the idea of the Tao, the path, is the actual meeting point between absolute opposites, where you've got the yin on one side and the yang on the other. The Tao is the line, the infinity that they both connect at. And the thing is that when you look at a yin yang, it's just a solid still picture, but what it's supposed to um, emit in your mind is a constant pushing against each other of total opposites. It's a battle, it's a balance that has to be struck, and there's going to be pushing on one side that leads to a reaction of pushing on the other, and you have to find the balance point in between those things. And so, to speak to your point between what is safe, what is known, and what is unsafe, or at least chaotic in a way that it's unknown, you need to find that Tao for yourself, because it's never going to be one thing or the other. It's going to be a combination of both.
Hmm. I love that. How do you find that Tao? What are like your self-care fundamentals that are a part of every your day that help you find that center, that help you find that balance between the yin and the yang, between the two poles to find your center?
Mm. Well, in the world we live in now, the very digital world where we're connecting right now over a podcast, thousands of miles apart, and everybody, connects with each other in a global way through social media and through the internet and through, shows that we watch and personalities that we otherwise wouldn't have come into contact with. We are living in an ecosystem where, not only, to speak to your point, you have to figure out what is going to be the self-care for yourself, or otherwise you'll go insane. And people, I see it all over the place. And I mean, I've fallen afoul of it from time and again too, and have to learn from my own mistakes to find that balance point. But I definitely, I've built for myself an internal radar of when I'm going either too far in one direction, or I see other people that are going too far in one way. It's almost like a flavor to their discourse. It's like, I think that this is being influenced by either propaganda or ideology or something that is steering a little too heavily away from what has become for me almost like a visceral feeling of, that's not it. For me, that's not it. And I'm going to try to either back away from that or go in a different direction to sort of try to guide myself, almost like sonar in the dark. But it becomes a process where if I feel like Man, I've been doom scrolling on Instagram for the last 45 minutes and it's not doing me any good. I got to just put the phone down for, a few hours or maybe the rest of the day. And that's maybe not the best thing for somebody who has so much digital footprint that I need to keep up on through posting memes and doing podcasts and everything else that I do. But yeah, I think that there is a necessity to people overuse the term detox, but really you need to like allow for some fresh air to enter your psyche, because if all you do is stay in the stagnant air of what ends up typically becoming an echo chamber, you can really get sort of like a prisoner's insanity going on, stuck in those feedback loops.
Hmm. I'd love to learn more about how you take care of yourself physically.
Mhm.
Some of your self-care, physical self-care. What does that look like? And how do you stay active as a jujitsu practitioner injury-free?
Well, wait a sec. I was with you until the last bit. I can stay active as a jiu-jitsu practitioner. I've never been able to do it injury free.
Me neither. That's why I'm asking. Me
Yeah.
neither. That's why I'm asking.
That's one of those chaotic things you can never really avoid. They call it the gentle art, but I really feel like that's tongue in cheek because it is not anything but gentle. Like, sure, we're not bludgeoning each other like in the striking arts, but man, we are literally trying to bend our limbs in exactly the opposite direction God meant them to go. Like, we're doing terrible things to our body all the time. So,
Crushing
I
the
mean,
spine.
oh yeah, I mean everything is about making somebody, forcing them to give up because of the physical peril you're putting them in, whether choke them unconscious or break their joints in unnatural directions. So I mean, to come back to the point, physically, I get almost all of my physical exercise through jujitsu. So it's maybe not the most holistic way I could for sure, but it's something that I've been able to do on the road, regardless of where I am, because thankfully, in the time we live right now in the 2020 era, in that decade, the jiu-jitsu is everywhere in North America. When I first started in Alberta, there was one black belt in all of Alberta. Now it's probably well into the hundreds. So in a period of coming up on 18 years, I started in 2007. It's exploded in a way that has become a real part of the culture. So everywhere you go, especially down in the southern states, there's jujitsu everywhere. I mean, I'm in Texas, which has become one of the meccas of jujitsu. So I can basically drop in at any open mat anywhere and just get some exercise in, and I get to know the community and learn other people's stories, which is always fun for me. But I keep myself active through jujitsu. Injury free is another thing. I definitely could probably use a little more yoga in my life. I've heard, and you can speak to this more than I can, that yoga itself is basically like the perfect antidote to the problems of jujitsu physiologically, because most of jujitsu is crunching in, whether you're passing someone's guard or whether you're opposing themselves as a guard. Everything is a crunching forward motion, whereas yoga, everything is a stretching backwards motion. And so there's a yin and yang involved there that I definitely am not the person to talk to in that, because I crunch in more than I stretch out, and I those are the injuries that I tend to get, is just overworking or straining or tearing things because of that sort of curling in uh, desire.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just not jujitsu. It's just really our modern world. Everyone on their
Hmm,
keyboards, sitting in
it's
chairs,
true.
driving, hunched forward. We're rounding forward. And the yoga helps not only open the body physically, but like I feel it helps open like once my heart. It helps me find that center, that calm in the storm that I can apply to the jujitsu. So I know what my nervous system, like I could tell when I'm in my fight or flight, and I can down regulate into my parasympathetic, like because you don't want to be like you're in your sympathetic, like revved up the entire time. No, in whether that be in a hard yoga posture or an intense roll, like you need to take moments to breathe. Another huge thing that yoga complements to my jujitsu is learning about the breath and how to down regulate when you need to, and know how to
Hmm.
turn it on and off at will and when you choose. But
Is that something
yeah,
you found you're able to implement in live roles?
yeah, definitely.
Hmm.
Definitely, especially like when you're like in a safe position, like you have the back or
Hmm.
you're on top, and just like controlling your breathing while putting kind of pressure on their diaphragm or on them, which you dysregulate them. So kind of using that twofold.
Yeah, yeah. For me, it became I mean, everybody gets there eventually. The longer they do jujitsu, it becomes more automated, more autonomous in their movements. But the efficiency of jujitsu is really what I feel like the difference is between a brown belt and the black belt is they have a higher efficiency rate. It's not that their cardio necessarily is better, it's that they can choose when and how to expend their energy in the most efficient manner. But for me, it was always a subconscious thing. It was something I never consciously affected for myself in a role. It was just like, I know that I'm redlining a little hard here, so I'm going to sit into my half guard and sort of allow for it to shield my waning cardio. But you're saying that it's something that you've actively, consciously been able to integrate?
Yeah, it's because of awareness, right? Yoga creates that awareness, and then
Hmm,
I just feel it becomes in my awareness more often than not, and it transcends beyond the subconscious, which it is happening, into the conscious. So I have
that's
conscious
cool.
control over that too. And then another very tangible benefit is just the hips. Like the hips from yoga is money for jujitsu.
Yeah. Yeah, thankfully, I that was one of my attributes when I started. I was a long bendy boy, and I always had like a really good butterfly mobility through my hips, which made
Yeah.
me a guard player primarily. I'm like 70 or 80% guard player in the way that I roll, but I run into a lot of other guys too that are, that's not the way their body was built, and they have a really hard time opening their hips. I could see how that would be incredibly valuable because it's something I rely on constantly.
Yeah, and to be able to just create space and distance
Yep.
between yourself and the opponent. So yeah, that's been a tool for mine, yoga. But another tool, personally, and I'm curious if this has been one of your tools as well, and that's psychedelics.
Okay.
On the path of, you know, getting to the root of what is consciousness, who am I,
Mm,
how to know thyself. And you mentioned the brain evolving, finishes evolution around like 24 and 25, and I believe like that's ideal, like when you should allow your brain to develop before experimenting with altered states of consciousness. But
mm.
I've had positive experiences with that, and many of my guests as well. So I'm curious to what role psychedelics in whatever form that may be have played on your journey of self-discovery.
I love this. This is the part of every jujitsu podcast where Joe Rogan asks if you've done DMT. It's become the trope that everybody waits for. It's like, bro, have you done DMT? Um, for myself, so I could get into this in a bunch of different ways because I'm very interested in not just the psychedelics themselves, but the psychedelic affects. That would be the out of body or the ethereal introspections and projections that people have experienced through those mediums. I'm actually less interested in the medium itself, whether it's psilocybin or DMT or whatever, and more interested in the actual affects of them after the fact. And I've been able to, you know, unexpectedly get into certain states that are disambiguated from my body in very weird ways. I wrote about that actually in my first book in the first portion of consciousness because I've the opposite of that obviously is the unconscious, and the unconscious in the Jungian sense is just as large as the conscious, and to be unaware of it is to basically be unconscious of reality to a degree of at least 50%. And so I've delved deeply into that in my own ways, but I haven't touched the psychedelic roots yet. And it's not because I'm not going to. I just personally don't want to until my kids are no longer in my care. And that may sound strange, but as a father, I'm more concerned about the profundity that I may get from such trips. Could like I'm a single income provider that's taking care of six people, and I can't afford to be worrying about or contemplating up on a mountainside in the Himalayas of my mind for 3 months after a devastating DMT trip, Like I got to keep things together, although I love everything about it. I do plan on doing probably either DMT or psilocybin or ayahuasca once my kids have fledged, I'll put it that way. And I've got friends that are big into it that not only have shown me or given me entry into that space. I've got a friend who runs a jujitsu camp that does ayahuasca trips specifically down in Mexico, and he's invited me to come down a number of times. I'm like, I want to, and I'm going to, but it's just not yet. Just not yet.
Hmm.
So I see the value in it. I love the value in it. I think there's a ton of discovery and exploration to be done there. For myself personally, I'm a spectator at this point.
And the cool thing is, I believe there's multiple routes to the same
Hmm.
ahas, the same knowings, the same truths. Some of them that I've experimented with has been just like the breath, like holotropic breath. Different
Mm,
type of breathing exercise could lead you to ecstatic states. Meditation, dance. There's different routes to find, and even religion,
hmm
faith. Um, to find similar truths and knowings. One thing I'm curious about is your relationship with fear. How
mm.
has fear raised its head um, on your journey, and how have you come to terms, or how have you made it an ally or an enemy, or yeah, just what is your relationship with fear? How has it evolved?
Yeah, that's a great question. That could be a whole podcast in and of itself. If you were to ask Carl Jung about that, he would probably place fear on the shadow side of the self. And it's not because it is evil. People misunderstand his constructs in that way. The shadow side is just the unconscious side. And you can make arguments about the lizard brain and the amygdalic response and like that fight or flight that you're talking about, which is a primordial function of the brain meant to keep you alive. And that's the reason why it's there, and that's why it's valuable to keep you from saber-toothed tigers, et cetera, to progenerate your genes in the Darwinian sense. Okay, but what we're talking about when we're talking about the actual interaction and affects of fear on a psychological level is something that I don't think you should ever be comfortable with, but it's nothing that you should ever shy away from, which is its own kind of Tao, because it's one thing to understand that things are terrifying and to give them the deference they deserve because of the terrifying nature of them. And it's another thing to do the thing anyways. It's kind of like the walking off that platform moment where there's a saying, I think it's came from the army or military of some country somewhere sometime, it's a euphemism at this point or an aphorism of courage isn't not feeling fear, it's feeling fear and doing it anyways. And I think that that is, again, a muscle that you will flex and grow over time the more you do it, but it's never meant to be a comfortable thing. There's no soldier that should be comfortable walking into gunfire. They should be alert and they should use that fear. I mean, there's that book called The Gift of Fear. And the guy writes about that throughout the whole thing is fear. And Gavin DeBecker, I believe is his name, he runs security details for incredibly wealthy and powerful people. And he's like, the only reason I'm able to keep them safe is I understand the value of fear that they should be feeling because those are real things. There are stalkers and there are killers and bomb threats and things that they have to worry about. And he's like, I'm always thinking worst case scenario, not because I'm a fear monger, but because I want to make sure that I am ready and prepared to the nth degree to deal with the worst case scenario. So, I mean, to answer your question, it's a valuable tool, but I don't think it's something that you can ever really become friends with. You shouldn't.
Mhm. So much wisdom shared, and I'm really thankful for Drew. A lot of this wisdom has been gleaned through your personal experience, and others have been, some of it has also been taught and inspired to you by various teachers, helpers, mentors you've met along the path. So let's take a moment just to acknowledge some of those helpers, whether like they've been in-person helpers or coaches or people that you've read their books.
Mhm.
You mentioned a few, Jordan Peterson, Carl Jung, but maybe there's others, or maybe you want to elaborate more on these. But yeah, let's just single out a few of these notable mentors and helpers that have helped you on your path, and what have been like the major takeaways learned from them that you've incorporated into the man you are today.
Mhm. Well, I mean, fundamentally, from my early childhood on, it would be the Bible to begin with. So all of the wisdom that has been passed down through the Judaic traditions of thousands of years ago, and that gets distilled into a meta heuristics that are super, super valuable. Just like truisms that have regardless of your culture or your time period, they're human truths, right? And of course, spiritual truths, deep spiritual truths. So I think a lot of my foundation started from that. That was the gift that I was, bestowed in a way that I can't imagine what life would be like, how much more difficult it would be to find those things if I had to find them for myself. But that being said, I have had to find a lot of them for myself to sort of qualify them. And that is, again, one of those balancing situations that you have to sort of step outside the guardrails to maybe figure out why they were there to begin with. And I feel like you're better off, even if you had to step out before coming back, than just taking it at face value in a lot of ways. It's something you can't do for everything necessarily, but the more you do, I think just the more broad your wisdom can be built. And really the value of wisdom comes down to your ability to discern, right? People think that wisdom is something that can be betrothed, but it's the response of action or the results of action in sort of a Newtonian sense. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The opposite reaction may just be finding out why you knew the thing you knew before, and the value of it. And the knowledge of that will lead to you being able to discern before you fall off of those stop gates in the future. And that I think is the value behind it. But to give credence to people who have helped me do that. I mean, you mentioned Matt Enns earlier in the podcast. I forget if we were recording or
Yeah.
not, but he's a
No, not
mutual
yet.
friend. Yeah, he's a mutual friend who's been a fantastic, not just mentor, but kind of compatriot along the very similar path. We both ended up fleeing Canada in the same time period for many of the same sociological reasons. We ended up both having to try to rebuild ourselves from scratch for very similar reasons with a family. And he was on my podcast at least once a week for almost 2 years, where I do Monday with Matt, and we would talk about all these types of questions and situations. And he was the one that introduced me to Jung, and eventually through Nietzsche, and through a lot of the philosophers of the 18 and 1900s, that really opened up not just my mind but my interest into that sphere. And then all of those stalwarts of the past, whether it's J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or fill in the blank, Orwell, a lot of these people that built out sort of rules of thumb through the literature that they've built. G.K. Chesterton is another one. And then a lot of podcasters out there, believe it or not. Podcasting is a weird thing because you have an audience that you never really directly interact with, but as an audience member, you feel like you know the person on the other side of the mic in a way that is almost like an ethereal friend. So I've had a lot of connection through popular podcasters, whether it's Joe Rogan or Jordan Peterson or Eric Weinstein, or fill in the blank. There's just so many people that have had such valuable conversations with me as the fly on the wall, and I feel like I've learned from them and their guests in a way that it's an education that I think is highly underrated right now, and that really is one of the driving motors to the zeitgeist of the time that we live in right now. And a lot of the value of wisdom that a lot of people have learned around us that we can glean and experience for ourselves comes through that medium. So I mean, I could sit here all day and list off names of that variety.
Yeah, no, I'm so curious to delve more into your story of podcasting and
Mhm.
what drove you to start your podcast, and now over 600 episodes later, how have you expanded it to such great success?
Yeah, well, I mean, it starts off in a way and for a reason that I didn't see coming. And to be honest, it's not something I would wish on anyone, to be honest. I was in a really bad place where I had defined myself as the jujitsu guy. I was Drew because I was the jujitsu guy, and I had a black belt in jujitsu, and I had an online presence because of jujitsu, and everybody knew me because of jujitsu, and I had ties through society, like all the way up to again Joe Rogan and Russell Brand and a lot of different people that were all over the world through jujitsu, and I had taken that into myself as this is who I am and this is the value that I have because of that. And then I found myself on the road in 2021 trying to flee my own government and having to ask myself, like, who am I? I can't even do jujitsu anymore. I haven't for almost a year at this point. And with that vacuum, I got pushed into having to not only find out who I am, but I became very depressed in the vacuous nature of the discovery of who I thought I was, and maybe who was hiding behind that mask the whole time. And I mean, to get down to the nitty gritty, I was at a point where I felt been gaslit for the better part of 2 years. Everybody knew that there was an elephant in the room that nobody was allowed to talk about. If you tried to do it publicly, you got shut down or you got deplatformed. And, I had not just opinions about what was going on, but I had real life experience. Like my sister was paralyzed through her vaccine, and I wasn't allowed to believe that that's what did it. I wasn't allowed to say that that's what did it, even though she had a neurologist corroborate that that's what did it. She wasn't even allowed to believe that that's what it was. And like we were in that level of disassociation as society, and I just couldn't take it anymore. And I was under so much psychological pressure that I just decided to let it all out in a way that was very dangerous for me, to be honest. And it sounds hyperbolic maybe to some people. It was very dangerous. I basically put my entire persona and my reputation on the chopping block for going forth during the time that I did to say the things that I did for about a 45-minute podcast, where at that point I was podcasting jujitsu podcasts, and I had one that was the Because Jitsu podcast. And I'd literally been podcasting about jujitsu for over a year when I can't do it. And it felt like such a fake. I felt like such a fake. And I decided I'm just going to totally pivot on this and do the thing I'm not supposed to do that dangerous thing, walking off the edge and see what happens. And I started with a podcast called The Elephant in the Room, and I just ranted for 45 minutes about it all, about the indignity of it all, about being an unvaccinated person, which made me a secondary citizen, and all of the affects of that in Canada that led me down to the US, and the indignity of my sister losing the function of her legs, and everybody saying that it's okay and it's not a big deal and it's not actually the thing it actually is, and sort of belittling her and trying to force everybody into the same path and into the same ignorance. And I was so mad. I was just so mad about it all, and I just let it all out. I ranted and I vented for about 45 minutes, and then I turned it off. I published it, or I set it to publish the next day, and I walked in thinking I had just committed social suicide. Like I walked into my trailer afterwards and sort of hugged my wife and said, I don't know what Pandora's box I just opened, but that damn thing is wide open right now, and I'm going to steer into it. And she's like, you should. You should. We're on the same path here, and I believe in what you believe in, and you need to like be real and stop, hiding behind just the platitudes of what's safe and what's easy, and do the dangerous thing and be that personality if you need to be, to allow for again other people to follow in your wake. And in that sense, I have wound up being that person that has opened up whatever avenue I have for people, thousands of people at this point. I've got like somewhere around 500,000 downloads over the last 2.5 years of people that became regular listeners of what's Drew gonna rant about today when it comes to politics or society or even jujitsu. Like I have guests on all the time from all different walks of life. And the interesting thing, to speak back to all of these similarities throughout my life, is I didn't start a podcast to start a podcast. I started it for catharsis. I needed release of the venting of the pressures that were building inside me. It led and flowered into something that I could have never expected, and I honestly couldn't have produced or synthetically manufactured if I wanted to. And because of that, it both changed who I was, the trajectory that I went, the people that I've associated with, and the networks that have opened, including people like Matt Enns. And it has redefined my ability to define myself in a way that jujitsu couldn't have. And so in that Deleuzian sense, figured out or started to re-experience that person who isn't the pianist behind the hobby that made him popular or relevant, and have been stretching my wings, so to speak, in all sorts of different avenues to sort of see what is the value of the person I am for the time I have on earth. And it's been a fabulous journey. I've been enjoying it, and podcasting has been a crucial, critical vector of that exploration.
One of the first questions they asked you at the start of this conversation is about your personal mission, and that was to know thyself. So through all the highs and lows that is this hero's journey, what have you found about that answer? Who are you?
Yeah, I've discovered a lot of things about myself, and what's interesting is when you think that you're going to learn who you are, you think you're going to like observe a marble statue of all of its details and all of the specifics of who you are, but what you actually learn is more about who you're not, and it's almost like Michelangelo was famous. I think it was Michelangelo, it might have been Leonardo da Vinci. Maybe it was, no, I believe it was Michelangelo. Either way, famous Renaissance artist was famous for saying after he had chiseled away just a fabulous statue of a horse, somebody asked him, how did you do that from this block of granite, this cube block of granite? You built this beautiful, smooth, lifelike horse in 3 dimensions. He said it was simple. All I had to do was chip away everything that wasn't horse. And I feel like that has been the process for me, that discovering who I am was more relevant or obvious to discover who I wasn't and allow that for that to guide me to who I am, that mind of the ant that guides me. What are my driving forces that I didn't decide upon, but sort of decided upon me? And I feel like I know myself pretty well in that way now, that when questions or decisions come up that I need to use the wisdom and discernment that I've built up to this point, I know who I am to the degree that I can say no to the things I'm not going to do very easily. It's something I don't have to quibble about anymore.
How did that resilience come into play? Like, how come you don't have to quibble with that anymore? Stephen Pressfield, he describes resistance is that
Mhm.
negative force in the world that prevents us from fulfilling our dreams. How did you grab a hold of the reins of resistance?
Well, part of it is grabbing hold of the reins because, despite what Sam Harris might believe, I believe we have free will and we make choices at any given moment based upon our own actions or inactions. Part of it is grabbing the reins, but part of it is also feeling the tug behind them because I do feel like there is like that. If you have the Pressfield's version of resistance, that also means that there's a vacuum where you not only feel less resistance, but you almost feel a pull towards follow the
Uh,
pull. That's going to be the easiest way to figure out again not only who you are and what is best for you, but it leads you away from the things you're not and the things that you would have to like work against your better nature. And the more you do that, the more you figure out the nature of who you are.
Incredible. Every episode, I conclude with a final few questions, and we've gotten to that point, Drew. And the first question, it's a pretty big one, a pretty profound one, I feel, is that's through it all. What has been the greatest life lesson you've learned on your path and you feel called in this moment to share with me and whoever's listening in?
hmm If I were to give broad advice to anyone, because it would have to be broad, because I don't know who I'm talking to and what they're going through, what they've been through, or who they are, and what's led them to where they are. But
Yeah.
I would entreat you to believe in yourself, which sounds like a Nike ad, but really you need to believe in yourself first. In a very stoic sense, you need to start with yourself as one, as the person you are, because that, by the way, is the majority of the affect you can even cast onto the world. It starts and ends with yourself. You can't necessarily tell somebody else to do something and expect them to do it because they're their own autonomous sovereign person as well. You can't hope to affect local politics because you're only one in 100,000, or federal politics one in 20 or 100 million, or geopolitics, because there's layers and levels to this that are disassociated from the self, but that means that the most value you can get from any of your decisions and the choices you have to make in life start with the self. So believe in yourself, start to learn and value your decisions, learn from them and be honest with yourself about those, because that's what's going to help you learn again who you are to make it easier to stop quibbling about these decisions. So really, again, it sounds trite, but believe in yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Believe in yourself. In 3 words, Drew, how would you describe the experience you're having on this earth in your personal reality? So 3 separate words that you'd use to describe how you experience your world, your life, your existence.
Present, ongoing, exciting.
Present, ongoing, and exciting. Could you elaborate on each of those?
Sure. I could use Deleuze again one more time for this. In He had a philosophical framework of time that, you know, people think of time for obvious reasons as a linear arrow of the chronology of the linear arrow of time. You can only ever go forward, never backwards. Everything is always rushing down the river of time. Um, Interestingly, Einstein himself considered that a construct that was fallacious. I mean, through his theories of relativity and special relativity, he makes an argument at a quantum level that not only can time possibly run backwards, but affects may actually go retrocausally backwards. But besides the science of it, Deleuze had this idea that all there actually is the present, is the now, is the moment that you exist in. And there is no actual future. There's only ever the present. Now you can inform the future through the present, and that's what people conflate as the arrow of time. But if you instead think of you as the nexus point in between the total past and the total future, and exist in that almost Socratic or Buddhist sense of the now of the self, that is what I mean by present. And I feel like that is a better conception of what time actually is if you want to get the value of the time you have.
I love that. And ongoing. Why did you choose ongoing?
Um, just speaking to the unexpected nature of the now, of the present. You know, some people talk about you got to have a 1 year plan, a 2 year plan, a 5 year plan, a 10 year plan, a 1,000 year plan, whatever. That to me has become a joke at this point where, yeah, you can obviously aim for certain outcomes, but don't, I feel like by planning too much, trying to ordinate yourself into a construct that is preordained through your own, albeit weak efforts to make it into a reality, you may miss the forest for the trees. And there's so much beauty to experience in the now. Alan Watts talked about that, who was a Buddhist philosopher in the 1970s. He talked about everybody talks about the meaning of life as if life has a particular meaning, but the value and meaning in life is just to live. And if you don't understand that, you're going to miss the actual meaning of life.
You're gonna miss the sweetness of the song.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and exciting. You chose the word exciting. Is that a choice?
Oh, I guess. I mean, everything is going to depend on your reaction to stimuli. You can always choose to be happy or mad or sad or whatever. Um, but for me, the excitement of it is the unknown. Like it may be a terrible day today. It may be a fantastic day today. I don't know until I live it. And, I wouldn't have it any other way. I would feel like hell for me would be the known of everything is expected. I want experience to be unexpected. I want it to be exciting. I want to have the anticipation of the unknown. That to me is exciting, and I feel like that has been my life for a while now. And maybe for ill, maybe for good, but at the very least, it's been exciting.
hmm Final question. We're gonna play around with time, and we're gonna time travel right now. We're gonna time travel, and I'm gonna invite you to step into the body, maybe not the body, but the soul of your 85-year-old self. Who is that 85-year-old man? Where are you? Who are you surrounded by? What is the legacy you've left here in your 85 years? And what are the predominant feelings in your being, in your
Hmm,
presence?
man, that's a great question. Obviously, prognostication being what it is, it's more going to speak to who I am now. But who I would love to be would be somebody without regret, because I think that that's one of the biggest tragedies of the elderly is people that end up on their deathbed with I should have's, I would have's that never tried. And apparently that has sort of become the trope of the most common regret of the elderly is the things that they could have but didn't do. Um, I don't want to have a long list of those. So I hope that's who I am at 85.
Someone without regret. And what are would be the predominant feelings in your being, in who you are at 85-year-old?
I hope joy. I hope fulfillment. I know that happiness is not a destination, but I really hope that that is something that I can not only just experience and embody for myself, but for the sake of my children and my family. I hope it's something that I can be an example and an avatar for to help them through whatever path that they're going to find themselves on.
I just invite you just to close your eyes and just really connect with that 85-year-old man. That man who's lived a rich 85 years old of community, of connection, and does not have any regrets. Very few. Um, their embodiment of happiness. They're in joy. They're deeply fulfilled. Feel into that felt sense in the present. And I'm going to bring us back. I'm going to bring us back to current day, Drew. And that 85-year-old man, he whispers a message to you in your ear. What does he say?
Hmm. I don't know the words, but it feels like pride. It feels proud. I
Mm,
hope and I feel like he'll be proud of, all of the struggles necessary as much as nobody loves doing them. I hate the struggles day to day. Like life is not easy. It hasn't been easy for a very long time, but why would you want it to be? And I hope that I can make him proud.
You're doing so, and I just invite you to continue to lean upon that pride as you move forth on your journey now. Thank you so much, Drew. It's been a real pleasure and honor to get to know you better. For people wanting to connect with you, they can find you on Instagram
Mhm.
at Drew
Weatherhead.
Weatherhead,
Mhm.
Weatherhead. They can also find you at Drew W Author. And you have an exciting new book coming out, Fractures in Love, novel one of four of a brand new fictional series, which they can connect via your Instagram. And then um, your podcast is also linked through all your socials. Anywhere else they can find you, or any last closing words from you?
No, I'm not a hard person to find online. You can find one thing that connects to everything. So if you're into jujitsu, you'll find that. If you're into comedy, you'll find that. If you're into authorship, you'll find that. Podcast, you'll find that, et cetera, et cetera. But I just thank you for giving me the time today to interact with you, particularly Derek, and obviously the opportunity to hopefully touch some people out there that listen through your own network. And, we're only ever so many degrees separated, so it's nice to make those interconnections and cross-pollinate in this way. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, brother. Let's bring you in for a digital fist bump. Boom. Thank you so much. It's been a
Alrighty.
real fun. It's been a really great time.
My pleasure. My pleasure.